those little apes out of my plane now! They don't belong here!
Black twins ordered to move out of flight, and one call to dad cancels the entire flight in a way that proves some people's racism comes with a price tag they never expected to pay. Those kids need to be removed from this aircraft immediately. A flight attendant's voice trembled as she stood in the aisle of United Airlines Flight 3142 bound for Miami, her face conflicted between duty and disgust at what she was being forced to do. I have direct orders from the captain to move them to the back of the plane. They don't belong in these seats. This is not negotiable. The words hit 13-year-old twins Marcus and Maya like ice water thrown in their faces, their matching expressions shifting from confusion to hurt to fear in the span of seconds as they sat frozen in seats 12A and 12B, their hands instinctively finding each other across the armrest the way they'd done since they were toddlers seeking comfort in a world that kept teaching them their brown skin was somehow wrong. This wasn't a history lesson about Rosa Parks or the Freedom Riders. This wasn't something their parents told them about from decades past. This was happening right now on a Wednesday morning in 2025 aboard a modern aircraft with entertainment screens and Wi-Fi. And if you think racism died somewhere between the March on Washington and today, if you believe we've evolved past judging children by their melanin instead of their character, then you need to understand it didn't disappear. It just learned to hide behind pilot uniforms and airline policies while doing the exact same damage it always has, maybe even worse because now it pretends not to exist while actively destroying young lives. Marcus tried to speak, his voice cracking with the strain of staying calm when every instinct screamed to cry or run or do something except sit there being targeted. We have our boarding passes, we're supposed to be here, we're just going to our aunt's house for Easter. But the flight attendant wouldn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed somewhere over their heads as she repeated like a broken recording, "I understand, but I have my orders. You need to gather your belongings and move to the rear of the aircraft right now." Maya's hands shook as she clutched her phone, tears already forming because she'd heard stories from kids at school about this kind of thing happening but always believed it wouldn't happen to them, not to honor students with perfect attendance and parents who taught them to be respectful and follow rules. Not to twins who'd been so excited about this trip they'd barely slept the night before. Other passengers throughout the cabin had their phones out filming, recording this confrontation with the detached interest of people watching drama unfold on a screen instead of in real life right in front of them where intervention was possible, where speaking up might cost them comfort but could save two children from humiliation. A businessman too rose up, shook his head while recording. A woman across the aisle whispered to her husband but neither said a word to the flight attendant, and the silence of all these witnesses felt almost as violent as the removal order itself. The flight attendant's radio crackled and a male voice came through saying, "I need confirmation those passengers have been relocated. We cannot depart with them in those seats. If you believe children should never face discrimination for the color of their skin, keep watching because what happens next will shock you. And if you think airline racism is something we left in the 1960s, you need to see how one phone call brings an entire flight to its knees." Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now, because we're reading every single one and we need you to be part of this conversation. This story doesn't end the way you think, so hit that like button if you stand against racism and subscribe to this channel right now because we're exposing the incidents that airlines pray never go viral. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when these twins' father finds out what's being done to his children. Marcus looked at Maya with tears streaming down both their faces and whispered, "What did we do wrong?" Marcus whispered, "What did we do wrong?" through tears that blurred his vision. His sister Maya gripping his hand so tight it hurt, but the pain felt grounding, felt real in a moment that seemed impossible. But to understand how we got here, how two honor students ended up being targeted for removal by a captain they'd never even spoken to, we need to go back 8 hours to a house in Chicago where this Easter morning started not with discrimination but with joy and excitement and a family preparing their children for what was supposed to be a special trip. Marcus Anthony Williams and Maya Grace Williams, 13-year-old fraternal twins born 3 minutes apart, with Marcus always reminding Maya he was technically older, sat at their kitchen table that morning at 6 a.m. eating the pancakes their mother had made special because she knew they'd be too excited to eat much else. They were 8th graders at King Magnet School, both on the honor roll, with Marcus excelling in mathematics and coding while Maya dominated in debate and creative writing, twins who balanced each other perfectly the way their parents always said, Marcus's quiet steadiness complementing Maya's fierce eloquence. Their father, James Williams, was CEO of Williams Construction Company, a firm he'd built from nothing over 20 years into one of the most respected black-owned construction businesses in Illinois. A man who'd grown up poor but worked his way through night school and never forgot where he came from or who he was fighting for. Their mother, Patricia Williams, worked as a senior policy analyst for the Illinois Department of Human Services, a government position she'd held for 15 years, advocating for families who needed someone with power to see them as human beings deserving of dignity and support. The twins had been preparing for this trip for weeks, counting down days until they could fly to Miami to spend Easter weekend with their Aunt Lisa, their father's younger sister who'd moved to Florida 3 years ago and who they missed desperately, the aunt who sent care packages and remembered every achievement and made them feel seen in ways that mattered. Easter was their favorite holiday, not just for the religious significance their family honored but for the traditions, the egg hunts Aunt Lisa organized that were legendary in her neighborhood, the big Sunday dinner where everyone gathered and laughed and told stories, the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Marcus had packed his laptop hoping to show Aunt Lisa the coding project he'd been working on, a game about black inventors that he hoped might win his school's innovation competition, while Maya had carefully folded the dress their grandmother had given her before she passed. The lavender one with delicate embroidery that made her feel grown up and beautiful and connected to the woman who'd taught her that black girls could be anything they dreamed if they worked twice as hard and never let anyone dim their light. Their parents had prepared them thoroughly for traveling alone, this being their first flight without adult supervision, going over safety procedures and what to do if anything felt wrong and reminding them to be polite to flight attendants and follow all instructions because that's what good kids do. That's what Williams' children do. Their father had driven them to O'Hare International Airport that morning, the conversation in the car a mixture of excitement about the trip and last-minute reminders about calling when they landed and staying together and making Aunt Lisa proud. Check-in at the United counter had been smooth, the agent barely glancing at their IDs before printing boarding passes and tagging their small rolling suitcases, and security was normal, the TSA agents waving them through with the same board efficiency they showed everyone. They'd waited at Gate B-17 for 40 minutes, doing homework and texting friends and posting on social media about their first solo flight, Marcus reading a book about artificial intelligence while Maya practiced a speech she had to give when school resumed after Easter break. When boarding was called, they walked down the jetway with their backpacks, found seats 12A and 12B in the economy section, window and middle seat that their father had selected so they could sit together, and they'd settled in with the kind of comfortable excitement that comes from doing something new but not scary, something that felt like growing up in all the right ways. The plane was a 737, relatively new with clean seats and working entertainment screens, and other passengers filed past them, a businessman who immediately put in noise-canceling headphones, a young mother with a toddler who smiled at them, college students heading to Miami for spring break already laughing about their plans. The flight attendants during boarding had been lovely, a young Latino woman named Sofia who'd helped them stow their bags and asked if this was their first time flying alone, congratulating them when they said yes and telling them they were doing great. A black male flight attendant named David had brought them each a cup of apple juice without being asked, winking and saying first flight deserves special treatment, and for those first 20 minutes everything felt perfect, felt safe, felt like the world was exactly as kind as their parents had tried to prepare them to navigate. Then he appeared, the pilot walking from the front of the plane toward the cockpit, a white man who looked to be in his 60s with silver hair and a face that seemed pleasant enough until his eyes landed on Marcus and Maya in row 12, and something shifted in his expression, something subtle but unmistakable, a hardening around his mouth and a narrowing of his gaze that made both twins suddenly aware they were being evaluated and found wanting for reasons they couldn't name but somehow. He didn't speak to them, didn't acknowledge them directly, but his stare lingered long enough that Marcus shifted uncomfortably and Maya felt her stomach clench with an instinct that screamed danger even though nothing had actually happened yet. The pilot continued to the cockpit, the door closing behind him, and the twins exchanged a glance that communicated volumes without words the way only siblings who'd shared a womb could. Did you see that? Something felt wrong. Maybe we're overreacting, but the unease settled over them like a shadow they couldn't shake. 5 minutes later, Sofia, the flight attendant who'd been so kind during boarding, appeared in the aisle, her face troubled, Her body language completely changed from the warm welcome she'd offered earlier, and she stopped at row 12 looking at the twins with an expression that mixed reluctance and resignation and something that might have been apology, and she said in a voice that shook slightly, "I need to speak with you both about your seating." Sofia stood in the aisle at row 12 with her hands clasped in front of her like she was trying to hold herself together, her eyes not quite meeting Marcus and Maya's confused faces as she took a breath that seemed to cost her something and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I've been instructed by the captain to ask you to relocate to different seats." And the way she said instructed carried the weight of someone following orders she knew were wrong but felt powerless to refuse. Someone caught between her conscience and her career, between doing what was right and doing what authority demanded regardless of morality. Marcus looked up from his book, his face shifting from relaxed anticipation of the flight to concerned confusion. "Relocate? Why? Is something wrong with these seats? Did we do something wrong?" His voice carrying that particular quality of a child who's been raised to follow rules and be respectful, suddenly confronted with a situation where the rules don't make sense and respect isn't being returned. Maya's hand instinctively reached for her phone to pull up their boarding passes, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who believes documentation and proof matter, who still thinks showing evidence of rightness will protect against wrongness, and she held up the screen displaying their seat assignments clear as day. "We're in 12A and 12B, these are our seats. My dad picked them specifically so we could sit together by the window." Sofia's face crumpled slightly, pain flickering across her features before she managed to smooth it back into professional neutrality, and she said with obvious reluctance, "I understand that. I can see your tickets are valid. This isn't about your tickets being wrong. This is..." She paused, searching for words that wouldn't reveal the racism underlying this entire situation. "This is about Captain's orders. He's asked that you be moved to alternative seating, and as cabin crew I'm required to follow the captain's directives regarding passenger placement." The corporate language she used felt like a shield, like if she wrapped the discrimination in enough policy speak it would somehow become less discriminatory, less cruel, less exactly what it was, which was two black children being targeted for removal because a white pilot with power decided their presence offended him. "But why?" Maya asked, her voice starting to shake with the tremor that comes right before tears. "Why does the captain want us moved? We haven't done anything, we've been sitting here quietly, we're not bothering anyone. What reason could there possibly be?" The question hung in the air unanswered because there was no good reason, no legitimate explanation that wouldn't expose this for what it was, and Sofia's silence in response to that question was its own confession, her inability to provide justifications speaking louder than any words could. Other passengers in the surrounding rows were starting to pay attention now, conversations dying out as people tuned into the drama unfolding in row 12, phones coming out of pockets with that practiced casualness that meant they were preparing to record, to document, to bear witness in the most passive way possible, capturing injustice for content while doing nothing to stop it. Marcus felt his chest tightening with a familiar fear he'd experienced before in smaller ways, the security guard following him through Target, the teacher who assumed he'd cheated on a test he'd studied for because his score was too high, the countless microaggressions that taught black children their presence was always conditional, always subject to scrutiny, always one white person's discomfort away from being deemed inappropriate regardless of what they'd actually done. "Can we talk to the captain?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady even though panic was rising in his throat. "If he has concerns about us, maybe we can explain, maybe there's been a misunderstanding," the desperate hope of a child who still believes in fairness, who thinks if he can just communicate clearly enough the adults in charge will see reason and do the right thing. "That's not possible," Sofia said, her voice firmer now like she was trying to convince herself as much as them. "The captain is preparing for departure and cannot be disturbed. You need to gather your belongings and come with me to your new seats. This is not optional. This is a direct order from the pilot in command of this aircraft, and federal regulations require all passengers to comply with crew member instructions." She was hiding behind regulations now, using the law as cover for discrimination, weaponizing compliance to force children to participate in their own humiliation, and Marcus and Maya both recognized they were trapped in a system designed to protect authority even when authority was wrong, even when authority was racist, even when authority was targeting 13-year-old honor students for the crime of being black in seats someone decided they didn't belong in. "Where are you moving us to?" Maya asked through tears that were now falling freely down her cheeks, her voice small and broken in a way that made Marcus want to protect her, but he had no idea how because he felt just as powerless, just as targeted, just as afraid. Sofia's eyes finally met Maya's for just a second, and the guilt there was obvious before she looked away and said quietly to seats in the rear of the aircraft. And those words "rear of the aircraft" landed like a punch because both twins knew their history, knew what it meant when black people were told to move to the back, knew this was segregation wearing a modern uniform and speaking in policy language but fundamentally unchanged from what their grandparents had fought against 60 years ago. The businessman across the aisle had his phone up recording, his face carefully neutral, bearing witness but not intervening, and behind them a white woman whispered to her husband, "This doesn't seem right," but neither of them said anything to Sofia, neither of them challenged this obvious injustice, and their silence was its own violence, teaching Marcus and Maya that even when discrimination happens in plain sight with dozens of witnesses, most people will choose their own comfort over someone else's dignity, will choose not getting involved over protecting children who desperately need adults to stand up for them. Sofia's radio crackled and the pilot's voice came through cold and impatient, asking, "Have those passengers been relocated yet? I need confirmation before we can depart," and Sofia responded with, "Yes, sir, in progress now," her voice tight with shame she was trying to hide, and she gestured toward the aisle with a hand that trembled slightly. "Please, you need to come with me now." Marcus and Maya sat frozen in their seats, their bodies refusing to cooperate with an order that felt fundamentally wrong even though they'd been raised to respect authority, raised to follow instructions from adults in positions of power. But this authority was asking them to participate in their own degradation, and every instinct they had screamed against compliance even as fear of consequences for disobedience paralyzed them into inaction. Sofia stood waiting, her face a mask of professional patience that barely concealed the discomfort radiating from her posture, and she said with forced gentleness, "I know this is confusing and upsetting, but I really need you both to cooperate. The captain has made his decision and we cannot delay departure any longer. Please gather your things and follow me to the rear of the aircraft where you'll be more comfortable." The lie in that last part, the suggestion that being forcibly relocated to the back of the plane would somehow be more comfortable than the seats they'd been assigned, would have been laughable if it wasn't so devastating, and Maya looked at her brother with eyes that asked, "What do we do? Do we fight this? Do we refuse?" But Marcus knew from the stories their parents told and the reality they lived that black children who refused orders from white authority figures often paid prices there. Families couldn't afford, often ended up in situations far worse than humiliation, often became hashtags and news stories and cautionary tales instead of kids who made it home safe. "We didn't do anything wrong," Marcus said one more time, his voice breaking on the last word, trying to make Sofia understand that compliance didn't mean acceptance, that moving didn't mean they agreed this was right, and Sofia nodded with what looked like genuine sympathy, but sympathy without action is just another form of cruelty, just another way of saying I see your pain but I value my job more than your dignity. David, the black flight attendant who'd been so kind during boarding, appeared from the forward galley, his face registering shock and anger as he took in the scene, Sofia standing over two crying black children demanding they move, and he approached quickly saying, "Sofia, what's going on here? What's the problem with these passengers?" Sofia turned to him with relief like she'd been hoping for backup, for someone to share the burden of this order, and she said quietly, "The captain wants them relocated. I'm just following his instructions." But David's face hardened with recognition of what this really was, with the understanding that comes from living in black skin and knowing racism when you see it even when it's wrapped in policy language. "These kids haven't done anything," David said, his voice low but firm. "Their tickets are valid. They're sitting in their assigned seats. On what grounds is the captain ordering their removal?" Sofia glanced around nervously, aware that other passengers were listening, that phones were recording, that this conversation was creating evidence that might come back to haunt everyone involved, and she said even quieter, "I don't know the grounds. I just know he called me specifically and told me those two passengers," pointing to Marcus and Maya, "needed to be moved to the rear before departure. He said it was his aircraft and his decision and I need to comply or he'd file an insubordination report." The admission hung in the air, damning in its honesty, revealing that this order had no legitimate safety or operational justification, that it was purely the captain's personal decision to remove 2 black children from seats he apparently felt they didn't belong in. And David looked at Marcus and Maya with an expression that mixed fury at what was happening and helplessness at his inability to stop it, because he knew that challenging a captain's direct order could cost him his job, could mark him as difficult, could end the career he'd worked years to build. "I'm sorry," David said to the twins, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry this is happening to you. This is wrong, this is completely wrong, and you need to know that." But his apology couldn't change their situation, couldn't protect them from what was about to happen, and Marcus felt anger rising through his fear, anger at a system that allowed adults to apologize for injustice while still enforcing it, that permitted people to acknowledge wrongness while maintaining their complicity. "If it's wrong, then stop it," Marcus said, his voice louder now, braver than he felt. "If you know this is discrimination, then don't let it happen. Tell the captain no. Tell him he can't do this." But David's face showed the painful calculus that people in marginalized positions constantly perform, weighing principles against survival, dignity against employment, standing up against getting knocked down. Sofia's radio crackled again, the captain's voice sharp with impatience. "I'm waiting on confirmation that those passengers have been moved. We're holding departure for this. Get it done now." And Sofia's face tightened with the stress of being caught between competing pressures, between her conscience and her commander, between what was right and what was required. She reached out as if to touch Maya's shoulder, then thought better of it, her hand dropping back to her side, and she said with finality that brooked no further argument, "You need to move now. I'm not asking any more, I'm telling you. Federal aviation regulations require passengers to follow all crew member instructions, and if you refuse, you'll be removed from this aircraft entirely and your parents will be contacted and you could be banned from flying. Is that what you want?" The threat worked because it was designed to work, because Maya and Marcus were 13 and scared and didn't want to make things worse, didn't want to be the reason their Easter trip got canceled, didn't want to disappoint their parents who'd trusted them with this responsibility, so they stood on shaking legs and gathered their backpacks with hands that trembled. And the walk down that aisle toward the rear of the plane became the longest journey of their young lives, every step a public humiliation witnessed by a plane full of passengers who watched and filmed and whispered but did not intervene, did not say stop, did not use their voices or their privilege or their humanity to shield 2 children from cruelty that should never have been allowed to happen. If you're watching this and thinking someone should have spoken up, someone should have defended those kids, then subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being that someone next time. Commit to speaking up when you see injustice instead of filming it, because your silence costs people their dignity and sometimes their safety. And if you can't hit that subscribe button after watching children be terrorized for being black, then you're part of the reason this keeps happening. Row after row they walked, past businessmen who looked away, past families who shielded their children's eyes as if witnessing racism was more traumatic than experiencing it, past college students who recorded everything but said nothing, all the way to row 38, the very last row of the aircraft, where Sofia finally stopped and gestured to the 2 seats by the window, cramped and small and right next to the bathroom that already smelled faintly of chemicals and confined desperation. Marcus and Maya slid into the cramped seats in row 38 with movements that felt mechanical and disconnected, their bodies going through motions while their minds struggled to process what had just happened, the humiliation of that long walk still burning in their chests like acid that wouldn't dissipate no matter how many times they swallowed against it. The window seat and middle seat that had felt like an adventure in row 12 now felt like a cage in the last row, pressed against the back wall of the aircraft with the bathroom door mere feet away and the constant sound of the toilet flushing and water running creating a soundtrack of indignity that matched their emotional state perfectly, trapped in the least desirable location on the plane because someone with power had decided their skin color made them unworthy of the seats their father had carefully selected and paid for. Sofia hovered in the aisle for a moment looking like she wanted to say something, maybe apologize again or explain or justify her actions, but what words could possibly make this okay? What explanation could transform forced relocation based on race into anything except what it was? So she just nodded once and walked away quickly, her shoulders tight with the tension of someone carrying guilt they don't know how to put down. Maya pressed her face against the window watching clouds drift past below them as the plane finished boarding, tears streaming silently down her cheeks and dripping onto the hoodie she wore, the purple one with her school's debate team logo that usually made her feel proud but now just felt like a costume. Like she'd been playing dress-up as someone who mattered when really she was just a black girl who could be moved around like cargo whenever a white man with authority decided she was in the wrong place. Marcus sat rigid in the middle seat, his hands clenched into fists on his lap, anger and shame warring inside him in ways that made his stomach hurt and his head pound, anger at the pilot who'd targeted them without even speaking to them, at Sofia who'd followed orders she knew were wrong, at David who'd apologized but hadn't protected them, at every single passenger who'd watched their humiliation and done nothing. But underneath the anger was shame, irrational and unwanted but present. Nonetheless, the shame that comes from being singled out and degraded in public, the feeling that somehow he must have done something to deserve this even though his rational mind knew better, knew this was about racism, not about him. But 13-year-olds aren't always rational when they're traumatized, and Marcus felt the shame settling into his bones like it planned to live there permanently. The plane's engines roared to life, that distinctive sound of thrust building as they taxied toward the runway, and both twins felt the reality settling over them that they were trapped now, sealed inside a metal tube at the mercy of a pilot who'd already demonstrated he saw them as problems to be managed rather than children to be protected, and there was no escape. No way out except to endure whatever else this flight had in store for them. Other passengers in the rows ahead settled into their flights, pulling out laptops and tablets and books, putting in headphones and reclining their seats, beginning the rituals of comfortable air travel that Marcus and Maya were excluded from by their forced exile to the worst seats on the aircraft. And the contrast between their suffering and everyone else's casual comfort felt like another layer of injustice. Another reminder that their pain didn't register as important enough to disrupt other people's convenience. The pilot's voice came through the intercom smooth and professional as he welcomed everyone aboard United Flight 3142 with service to Miami, estimated flight time 2 hours and 40 minutes. Weather looking beautiful, sit back and enjoy your flight, and Marcus felt rage surge through him at the casual pleasantness of that voice. At this man who'd just humiliated them speaking as if everything was normal, as if he hadn't just enacted segregation at 30,000 feet, and Marcus wanted to scream, wanted to stand up and tell everyone what this pilot had done, but his voice felt frozen in his throat by the knowledge that no one would believe him over a captain, that speaking up might make things even worse, that black children who challenge white authority often pay terrible prices for that courage. The plane lifted off. That moment of defying gravity that usually thrilled Marcus, that feeling of rising into sky and leaving Earth behind, but today it just felt like being carried further from safety, from home, from the parents who would have protected them if they'd known what was happening. Maya turned away from the window, unable to watch the ground disappearing, and she leaned against Marcus's shoulder the way she had since they were toddlers, seeking comfort in the one person who understood exactly what she was feeling because he was feeling it too. And they sat pressed together in those cramped seats. Two 13-year-old kids who'd been excited about Easter and adventure that morning now just trying to survive a flight that had become a nightmare. The seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers throughout the cabin began moving around, standing to retrieve items from overhead bins, heading to the bathroom, the normal activity of a flight in progress, and flight attendants emerged from the galleys pushing beverage carts down the aisles, asking passengers what they'd like to drink, offering snacks and napkins with professional smiles. Marcus watched the cart move slowly from row to row in the economy section ahead of them, watched passengers receive their drinks and their tiny bags of pretzels, watched the flight attendants, Sofia among them, work their way methodically backward through the cabin, and he waited for the cart to reach row 38, waited for someone to ask them what they wanted, to offer them the same basic service being provided to every other passenger on this flight. But the cart stopped at row 37, the row directly in front of them, and after serving those passengers, after handing out drinks and snacks to everyone else in their section, Sofia and the other flight attendants simply turned the cart around and began pushing it back toward the galley, bypassing Marcus and Maya entirely as if they were invisible, as if they didn't exist, as if children banished to the back of the plane for racist reasons didn't deserve even the basic dignity of a cup of water or a snack to ease the discomfort of a flight they'd been forced to endure in the worst possible conditions. Maya's voice came out small and uncertain as she called after the departing beverage cart, "Excuse me, could we get something to drink please?" The words polite and careful because even in the middle of being mistreated she'd been raised to use her manners, to say please and thank you, To be the kind of black child who couldn't be accused of being rude or demanding or any of the stereotypes that get weaponized against children who look like her. Sofia paused for just a fraction of a second, her shoulders tensing in a way that suggested she'd heard Maya's request, but then she continued pushing the cart forward without turning around, without acknowledging the question, disappearing into the galley and leaving Marcus and Maya sitting in row 38 with nothing, no water, no juice, no pretzels, no recognition of their basic humanity or needs. Marcus felt something break inside him at that deliberate ignoring, at the realization that their exile to the back wasn't just about seating, it was about being erased, being made invisible, being treated as if their presence was so offensive that even basic service couldn't be extended without validating their existence in a way the pilot clearly didn't want validated. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, the screen blurry through tears he was trying desperately not to let fall because crying felt like giving up, like admitting defeat, and he navigated to his father's contact, pressed the call button, and held the phone to his ear listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before a recorded message informed him that cellular service was not available at this altitude. Please try your call again later. Maya tried calling their mother, her fingers fumbling with the phone as hope and desperation made her movements clumsy, and she got the same result, the same automated message explaining what they already knew, that they were 35,000 feet above ground with no way to reach the people who loved them, no way to ask for help, no way to tell someone in authority what was happening to them because the only people in authority on this aircraft were the ones perpetrating the mistreatment. She tried texting instead, typing out a message to their mother that said, "Mom, something bad is happening on the flight. The pilot made them move us to the back and now they won't give us food or water and we're scared. Please help." But when she hit send, the message just sat there with a little exclamation point next to it indicating failure to deliver, the words trapped in her phone the same way she and Marcus were trapped in this plane. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness, each one feeling like an hour, and Marcus and Maya sat in their cramped seats watching other passengers enjoy their flights. Watching people laugh and chat and watch movies on their entertainment screens while the twins had nothing except each other and their growing thirst and the humiliation that sat heavy in their chests, making it hard to breathe properly. A businessman in row 35 reclined his seat so far back it nearly hit Maya's knees, the sudden invasion of their already limited space startling her, but when she looked up to see if he'd noticed or cared, the man was already asleep with noise-canceling headphones on, completely oblivious to the suffering happening directly behind him or perhaps just completely indifferent to it. And Maya wondered how people learned to not see, how they trained themselves to ignore injustice happening. Inches away. The bathroom door opened and closed repeatedly, passengers walking past Marcus and Maya to use the facilities, some making eye contact and quickly looking away when they saw the tears on the twins' faces, others not even glancing at them, treating them like furniture that just happened to be near the bathroom, objects rather than children. A white woman in her 40s emerged from the bathroom and accidentally made extended eye contact with Maya, saw the devastation written across the girl's face, and something flickered in the woman's expression, maybe recognition, maybe discomfort, but she hurried back to her seat without saying anything, without asking if they were okay, without offering any gesture of solidarity or support. Marcus checked his phone every few minutes hoping for a signal, hoping that somehow the laws of physics would bend and allow him to contact his parents, to summon the help they desperately needed, but the screen showed the same lack of service every time, mocking him with its uselessness. He thought about his father, about the man who'd built a company from nothing through sheer determination and who'd taught Marcus that hard work and excellence were armor against discrimination, and he wondered what his dad would think seeing his son now, sitting powerless in the back of a plane, unable to access even basic dignity, all that excellence and good behavior worth nothing against a pilot's prejudice. Maya's stomach growled audibly, reminding her that the pancakes their mother made that morning were hours ago now and they'd been too excited to eat much anyway, planning to get snacks on the flight, never imagining they'd be denied food as part of their punishment for existing while black in seats someone decided they didn't belong in. She watched another beverage service start up, watched the cart emerge again from the galley and begin its journey through the cabin, and some desperate part of her hoped maybe this time would be different, maybe this time they'd be included, maybe someone would recognize that children shouldn't be starved and denied water regardless of what seat they're sitting in. But the cart stopped at row 37 again, served everyone ahead of them again, and turned around again without acknowledging Marcus and Maya's existence. And this time Maya didn't call out, didn't ask, because the first rejection had taught her that asking made it worse, made the deliberate nature of their exclusion more obvious, more intentionally cruel, and she couldn't bear to be ignored again, couldn't survive another moment of calling out and having adults pretend they couldn't hear. The flight stretched ahead of them, 2 more hours of this isolation, 2 more hours of thirst and hunger and psychological torture disguised as policy, and Marcus and Maya held hands across the armrest and endured, because what other choice did they have? What other option existed except to survive until this plane landed and they could escape into their aunt's arms and try to forget? 90 minutes into the flight, Marcus's phone suddenly vibrated in his hand with such unexpected force that he almost dropped it, his heart leaping with desperate hope as he saw the screen light up with an incoming call, the words "Dad Mobile" flashing across the display like a lifeline being thrown to someone drowning, and he answered so fast he nearly fumbled the connection, his voice breaking as he said, "Dad, oh my God, Dad," before he could even hear his father speak, before he could confirm. The call had actually connected, the sheer relief of potential rescue overwhelming him completely. James Williams's voice came through clear and strong despite whatever cellular miracle had allowed this connection at altitude, his tone immediately shifting from casual greeting to urgent concern when he heard the distress in his son's voice. "Marcus, what's wrong? What happened? Are you and Maya okay? Where are you?" And Marcus tried to answer, but the words came out in a jumbled rush of emotion and explanation. His 13 years of trained composure completely abandoned in the face of finally having an adult who loved him, who would believe him, who had power to help instead of power to harm. "Dad, they moved us." Marcus managed to get out between gasping breaths that might have been sobs. "The pilot ordered us moved to the back of the plane and they won't give us food or water and everyone's just ignoring us, and Dad, I don't know what we did wrong. We were just sitting in our seats and he saw us and then everything went bad." James Williams felt his blood pressure spike, felt rage coursing through his veins with such intensity that his hands clenched around the phone hard enough to make the case creak, and he forced his voice to stay calm for his son's sake even though inside he was screaming, even though every protective instinct he had was demanding immediate action. "Put me on speaker," he said with controlled fury. "I want Maya to hear this too. You're both going to be okay. I promise you I'm fixing this right now." And Marcus fumbled to switch the call to speaker mode, holding the phone between him and Maya so their father's voice could reach both of them, so they could both hear the promise of protection they'd been denied for the past 90 minutes. "Tell me exactly what happened from the beginning," James said, his tone shifting into the commanding presence he used in boardrooms when negotiations weren't going his way, when he needed people to understand he was serious and wouldn't accept anything less than what he demanded, and the twins took turns explaining through tears and anger, Maya describing the pilot's look when he walked past them, Marcus detailing Sofia's reluctant removal order, both of them painting a picture of systematic mistreatment that made James see red, that transformed a successful CEO and devoted father into a force of reckoning that would make everyone involved in this incident regret the day they decided to target his children. "That racist pilot made a catastrophic mistake," James said, his voice cold with the kind of anger that comes out as ice instead of fire, the kind that takes action instead of just making noise, because what he doesn't know, what none of them know, is that I'm a platinum member of the United Executive Council. I sit on advisory boards with the CEO. Richard Morrison and I play golf together twice a month and our families vacation together, and Richard takes discrimination incredibly seriously. Because he knows what it does to the airline's reputation and more importantly because he's a decent human being who will be horrified to learn what happened on one of his flights. "I'm calling him right now," James continued. "I'm hanging up with you and calling Richard directly. And kids, I need you to understand something. This ends in the next 10 minutes. You're going to see consequences happen in real time, and I want you to watch carefully because this is what happens when racism meets accountability." Maya's voice was small when she asked, "But Dad, what if they don't believe us? What if the pilot lies and says we were misbehaving or something?" The fear of not being believed so ingrained in her understanding of how the world works that even with her father's promise of help she couldn't fully trust that justice would actually come. James's response was fierce and certain. "Baby girl, they're going to believe you because I'm not giving them a choice, because I have power and connections and resources and I'm about to use every single one of them to make sure that pilot never works again, to make sure everyone who participated in your mistreatment understands there are consequences for targeting black children, and you and Marcus are going to see that sometimes, not always but sometimes, having a father who built something substantial means he can protect his kids in ways other families can't, and I hate that it takes that. I hate that justice is conditional on having the right connections, but right now I'm grateful I have them because I'm about to rain hell down on everyone involved in this. Marcus felt something loosening in his chest, not quite hope yet but the precursor to it, the possibility that maybe this nightmare would end, that maybe being powerless wasn't their permanent state, that maybe their father's love and influence could reach across distance and altitude to shield them from the hatred that had targeted them. Stay on the line, James said. I'm adding Richard to this call right now. I want you both to hear this conversation. I want you to witness your father fighting for you the way every black child deserves to have someone fight for them. And Marcus and Maya huddled together over the phone as they heard the dial tone, heard it ring twice, heard a distinguished voice answer with "Hello, James. What can I do for you?" And their father's response was immediate and devastating. "Richard, we have a crisis," James said without preamble, without small talk or social niceties. "Right now at this very moment my 13-year-old twins are sitting in the back of United Flight 3142 after being forcibly removed from their assigned seats by your pilot based purely on racial profiling. They've been denied food and water for 90 minutes. They've been isolated and humiliated, and I need you to understand that what's happening on that flight right now is a civil rights violation. And I'm documenting everything, and unless you take immediate action I'm calling every news outlet I know and making sure this becomes the biggest scandal your airline has faced this year." The silence on Richard Morrison's end of the call lasted only 3 seconds but felt eternal to Marcus and Maya, who sat frozen listening to their fate being decided by voices on a phone. And when the CEO spoke again his tone had transformed completely from casual friendship to corporate crisis management. The voice of a man who recognized immediately that this was serious, that this was the kind of incident that could destroy careers and tank stock prices and generate headlines that haunted companies for years. "James, give me the flight number again," Richard said, already typing in the background, the click of keyboard keys audible through the speaker. "And I need you to tell me exactly what your children experienced, every detail, because what you're describing is not just against our policies, it's illegal, it's discrimination. And if what you're saying is accurate then someone is getting fired today, possibly multiple people." James repeated the information with cold precision. United Flight 3142 from Chicago O'Hare to Miami departed approximately 2 hours ago, so they should be somewhere over Georgia or northern Florida right now, and his voice took on the cadence of testimony, of evidence being presented, as he walked Richard through Marcus's description of the pilot's look, Sofia's reluctant removal order, the forced relocation to row 38, the denial of food and beverage service, each detail landing like a hammer blow. "My children have been sitting in the back of that plane for 90 minutes being treated like they're contaminated," James continued, his fury barely contained beneath professional language. "They've done nothing wrong. They had valid tickets for seats I personally selected and paid premium pricing for, and some racist pilot decided black kids didn't belong in those seats and ordered them removed. And your flight attendant followed that order despite knowing it violated every anti-discrimination policy your airline supposedly upholds." Richard's breathing was audible through the speaker, sharp and angry, and he said with absolute conviction, "James, I'm looking at the crew roster right now. Flight 3142 is captained by Thomas Patterson. He's been with us 32 years. And if what your children experienced is accurate then his career ends today. I'm conferencing in our chief operating officer right now and we're calling that cockpit immediately." The sound of another line being added came through, a woman's voice identifying herself as Linda Chin Thuo, and Richard briefed her in 30 seconds flat, his words sharp and efficient, describing the situation and the implications, and Linda's response was immediate. "We need to contact that flight right now. We need to separate the captain from duties. And depending on what we find we need to ground operations and conduct a full investigation because if we have a pattern of discrimination, we're looking at DOT violations and potential lawsuits that could cost us millions." Marcus and Maya listened to their suffering being translated into corporate liability, into financial risk and regulatory consequences, and part of Maya felt sick that the wrongness of what happened to them mattered less than the money it might cost the airline, But another part of her felt a grim satisfaction that at least something mattered enough to generate this level of urgent response, even if it was the wrong thing. "Hold please," Richard said. "I'm calling the aircraft now. Stay on the line, James. The first want you to hear this." And the phone went silent except for ringing that seemed to stretch forever, each tone another moment of Marcus and Maya's hearts pounding with anticipation and fear, wondering what would happen, whether the pilot would lie, whether they'd be believed, whether justice was actually possible, or if this would somehow get twisted around to make them the problem. "Captain Patterson," a voice came through. "This is Richard Morrison, yo. And I need you to explain to me why I'm receiving reports that you ordered 2 minor passengers forcibly relocated from their assigned seats to the rear of the aircraft." And the silence that followed was thick with tension, with the captain clearly scrambling to figure out who had reported him, how his actions had reached executive level so fast, what story he could tell that would save his career. The twins could hear background cockpit noise, beeping instruments and radio chatter, and then Patterson's voice came through defensive and condescending. "Mr. Morrison, I don't know what you've been told, but I made a judgment call based on operational considerations. There were passengers in seats that I felt would be better accommodated elsewhere for weight and balance distribution purposes." "That's a lie," Richard said flatly, cutting through Patterson's explanation like it was paper. "Weight and balance decisions don't target specific passengers. They're made based on aircraft loading calculations done before departure by ground crew. And I have the load manifest for your flight right here showing the aircraft was within normal parameters, so let me ask you again, and I want the truth this time. Why did you order 2 13-year-old black children moved from row 12 to row 38, and why were they subsequently denied food and beverage service?" Patterson's voice took on a tone of aggressive defensiveness, the sound of a man realizing his lies weren't working but doubling down anyway. "I resent the implication that race had anything to do with my decision. I've been flying for United for 3 decades and I've never had a discrimination complaint. Those passengers were moved for operational reasons, and if they're claiming otherwise, they're lying or misunderstanding the situation." Marcus felt rage surge through him at hearing himself and Maya called liars, at this man who'd never spoken to them, never asked their names, never treated them like human beings, now claiming they were fabricating their own humiliation, and he wanted to scream into the phone, wanted to tell Patterson exactly what he thought of adults who abuse power and then lie about it. Richard's voice went cold enough to freeze water. "Captain Patterson, your explanation is inconsistent with documented airline procedures. Your story has already changed twice in this conversation, and I'm informing you now that effective immediately you are removed from command of Flight 3142. Your first officer will assume control. And upon landing you will be met by company security and escorted to a formal investigation meeting where your employment status will be determined." And Patterson started to protest, started to say, "You can't do this, I have union protection," but Richard cut him off with finality. "I absolutely can do this, and I am doing this." The cabin intercom crackled to life with a tone that made every passenger on Flight 3142 look up from their screens and conversations, that distinctive sound that meant something official was about to be announced, and the voice that came through wasn't Captain Patterson's smooth professional tone that had welcomed them aboard but a younger man's voice, uncertain and clearly reading from hastily prepared notes. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Chin. I've assumed command of this aircraft and I need to inform you that we will be making an unscheduled landing at Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in approximately 20 minutes due to a crew situation that requires immediate resolution. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and follow all crew member instructions." The confusion that rippled through the cabin was immediate and visible, passengers turning to each other with worried expressions, some pulling out phones to text loved ones despite the inconsistent signal, the low murmur of concerned conversations building like static, and Marcus and Maya sat in row 38 watching it all unfold with a mixture of vindication and exhaustion, their father still on speakerphone saying, "You hear that? That's justice starting to happen, that's what accountability sounds like when it finally catches up to racism." The cockpit door opened and Captain Patterson emerged, his face red and tight with barely suppressed fury, his movements stiff as he walked down the aisle toward the rear galley, and when he passed row 38 his eyes landed on Marcus and Maya for just a second, long enough for them to see the hatred there, the resentment at being held responsible for his own actions, the blame he was directing at 2 children for having the audacity to be connected to someone with power who wouldn't let Their mistreatment slide. Sofia appeared from the forward galley looking pale and shaken, her professional composure completely shattered as she moved through the cabin, and David, the black flight attendant who'd apologized earlier, was with her, both of them heading toward where Marcus and Maya sat. And when they reached row 38, Sofia's eyes were red like she'd been crying, her voice trembling as she said, "I need to apologize to you both. What I did was wrong. I should have refused the captain's order. I should have stood up for you, and I didn't, and I'm going to have to live with that cowardice for the rest of my life." David knelt in the aisle so he was eye level with the twins, his face showing a complex mixture of relief and anger and sadness. And he said quietly, "I just got word from corporate that Sofia's been suspended pending investigation, and I've been asked to provide a full statement about what I witnessed. And I want you both to know I'm telling them everything. I'm documenting every detail of how you were treated because what happened to you was wrong and everyone who participated needs to face consequences." Marcus didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know if Sofia's apology meant anything when it came only after she'd been caught, only after facing suspension, not when it might have cost her something to do the right thing in the first place, and he just nodded because he was too tired to perform forgiveness, too emotionally depleted to comfort the adult who'd hurt him just because she felt bad about it now. Maya accepted a bottle of water David offered, her hands shaking as she opened it and drank deeply, the first liquid she'd had in over 2 hours, and the relief of basic hydration mixed with bitterness that it took a CEO's intervention to get her a drink of water, that her humanity wasn't valuable enough on its own to warrant basic care. The plane began its descent into Atlanta, the change in altitude making ears pop throughout the cabin, and passengers who'd been quietly watching their screens or reading were now fully engaged in trying to understand what was happening, phones out recording, conversations speculating about the crew situation that had forced this diversion. A white woman in her 60s from several rows ahead made her way to the bathroom and stopped when she saw Marcus and Maya, really looked at them for the first time, saw their tear-stained faces and exhausted postures, and something clicked in her expression, recognition maybe, or guilt, and she said quietly, "I saw what happened earlier, I watched them move you, and I didn't say anything and I should have, I'm ashamed of myself and I'm sorry." Marcus appreciated the apology more than Sofia's because this woman had nothing to gain from it, wasn't facing consequences that motivated her words, she was just a bystander confronting her own complicity, but it still didn't change what had happened, still didn't give him back the innocence or sense of safety that had been stripped from him on this flight. The wheels touched down in Atlanta with a jolt that seemed heavier than normal, the brakes engaging hard, and through the windows Marcus could see a formation of vehicles on the tarmac, airport security, and what looked like United corporate representatives in dark suits, a welcoming committee assembled to handle the fallout of Patterson's racism. The plane taxied to a remote stand away from the terminal, stopping in an isolated area where the media couldn't easily access, and the first officer's voice came through the speakers again saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have officials boarding the aircraft who need to address a personnel matter before we can proceed. We apologize for this disruption and appreciate your patience." The forward door opened and 6 people boarded. 3 airport police officers and 3 individuals in United corporate attire, their faces grim with the seriousness of what they were there to handle, and they moved directly to where Patterson stood in the rear galley, one of the corporate representatives speaking in a low voice while the officers positioned themselves strategically. Patterson's voice rose in protest, his words carrying through the quiet cabin. "This is absurd. I've given 32 years to this airline. You can't destroy my career over." But he was cut off by one of the corporate representatives saying loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Captain Patterson, you're being relieved of duty and escorted off this aircraft. Your union representative has been contacted and will meet you for the formal hearing. You need to gather your belongings and come with us now." The humiliation of Patterson being escorted down the aisle past all the passengers he'd just been commanding, past Marcus and Maya who watched with complicated emotions, was complete and devastating. And some passengers actually started clapping, scattered applause that grew as he walked toward the exit, but Marcus didn't clap because there was nothing celebratory about any of this. The corporate representatives approached Marcus and Maya in row 38 after Patterson had been escorted off, their expressions carefully arranged into masks of professional concern that couldn't quite hide the calculation behind their eyes, the mental math of liability and public relations and damage control that came before genuine care for 2 traumatized children. The woman leading them, who introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh from United's Passenger Experience Division, crouched in the aisle and spoke in that particular tone adults use when they're trying to sound sympathetic but are really just managing a situation. "I am so deeply sorry for what you experienced today. This is not reflective of United's values or policies. And we want to make this right for you and your family in every way possible." Marcus and Maya listened to the corporate apologies with exhausted detachment, hearing words like unfortunate incident and isolated occurrence and commitment to diversity that felt hollow after what they'd endured, and Jennifer continued explaining that the flight would be canceled, that all passengers would be rebooked on other flights, that the twins would be given first-class seats on the next available departure to Miami with a United escort to ensure their comfort and safety. The cancellation of the entire flight felt like vindication on one level, proof that what happened to them was serious enough to disrupt 150 people's travel plans, but on another level it felt like punishment, like they'd somehow caused all this chaos by having the audacity to be black in seats someone didn't want them in. And Marcus could already imagine the resentment from passengers who'd be delayed for hours because of what they'd probably frame as those kids causing problems instead of a racist pilot abusing his authority. The other passengers were informed of the cancellation through the intercom, First Officer Chin explaining in vague terms that due to a crew incident the flight could not continue and everyone would be accommodated on alternative flights with meal vouchers and apology compensation, and the groans and complaints that echoed through the cabin made Maya want to shrink into her seat and disappear, made her feel responsible for inconveniencing all these people even though she knew intellectually that wasn't fair, that the blame belonged entirely on Patterson and the system that had allowed his prejudice to flourish for 32 years. Some passengers shot looks toward the back of the plane as they gathered their belongings, suspicious glances trying to identify who or what had caused this disruption, and a few seemed to connect the dots, seemed to remember the earlier scene of two black kids being moved, and their expressions ranged from sympathetic to resentful to carefully neutral. Marcus and Maya were escorted off the plane first, before the other passengers, walked through the jetway by Jennifer and another corporate representative named Michael Chen, who explained that their father was being connected to them as soon as they reached the gate, that hotel accommodations were being arranged, that United was taking full responsibility for this incident. The gate area they emerged into was busy with confused passengers from their canceled flight and travelers from other airlines, and James Williams was there on a video call on Jennifer's tablet, his face filling the screen with an expression of such fierce protective love that Maya started crying again, all the emotions she'd been holding back for 2 hours finally overwhelming her defenses now that she could see her father's face. "Baby girl," James said, his own eyes wet with tears he wasn't bothering to hide, "I'm so proud of how strong you and Marcus were. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I'm getting on the next flight to Atlanta right now and I'll be there in 3 hours, and your mother is already in the air. She left Miami the second I told her what happened and she'll be there in an hour." The knowledge that both their parents were dropping everything to reach them, that they wouldn't have to fly to Miami alone after this trauma, made Marcus feel like maybe he could breathe again, like maybe the world wasn't entirely hostile and dangerous if his parents' love could cross distances to shield him. Richard Morrison himself appeared at the gate 20 minutes later, the actual CEO taking time from whatever billion-dollar decisions he usually made to personally apologize to two 13-year-old kids, and he sat with Marcus and Maya in a private room explaining that Patterson had been terminated immediately, that his pension and benefits were being reviewed for potential forfeiture, that Sofia would remain suspended pending a full investigation into her failure to refuse an unlawful order, and that United was implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all crew members as a direct result of this incident. The apologies felt inadequate measured against the harm, the policy changes felt reactive rather than preventive, but at least they were something, at least there were consequences even if they came too late to prevent the trauma. If this story made you angry, if it broke your heart, if you recognized yourself in those silent passengers who filmed instead of speaking up, then subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being different next time. Commit to using your voice when you see injustice happening right in front of you, because children like Marcus and Maya are experiencing discrimination every single day while people around them choose comfort over courage, and your silence has a cost that someone else pays. So hit that subscribe button if you believe we can do better, if you believe protecting vulnerable people matters more than avoiding awkwardness. Patterson was fired and lost his career. Sofia was suspended indefinitely. The incident went viral with millions of views and think pieces about airline racism. United paid an undisclosed settlement to the Williams family and implemented new policies. But Marcus and Maya still had nightmares about that flight, still felt anxious in airports, still carried the knowledge that their skin color made them targets regardless of their achievements or their parents' success. They made it to Aunt Lisa's house eventually, spent Easter weekend being loved and celebrated, but the joy was muted by what they'd endured to get there, and when people asked how their first solo flight went, they didn't know how to answer. Didn't know how to explain that they'd learned a lesson no 13-year-old should have to learn about how racism works and who it protects and what it costs when it finally faces consequences that come too late to prevent suffering but at least prove that some people's prejudice isn't as untouchable as they thought it was.